We can then go to the triumph of Jesus's resurrection, where we have another two diptych scene, a nice collection of four sub-scenes that are related to each other as subsets. We have the empty tomb, first of all. And the empty tomb has been part of the tradition since Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel ended with the empty tomb, with the women going away saying nothing to anybody because they were afraid, an ending that led to an expansion with other stories about the appearances of Jesus. So much for Mark. But in any case, in all of the empty tomb stories, it's women who discover the tomb. And sure enough, it's women who have discovered the tomb here. But the first people who actually encounter the tomb and do so in some sort of significant way are the two disciples, Peter and the beloved disciple. So after they hear the report from Mary Magdalene that the tomb is empty, they do their foot race. And the beloved disciple gets there first, waits in deference to Peter until he gets there. Peter goes in, sees what's there in the empty tomb, goes out scratching his head. Peter the Rock is, as usual, kind of rocky, a little on the dense side. The beloved disciple goes in and sees the evidence of the sudarion, the kerchief or handkerchief that was around the head of Jesus, which is exactly the same word that was used back in the resurrection of Lazarus for one of the grave cloths there. The beloved disciple, in any case, goes in, sees that, and believes. What does he believe? Doesn't say exactly, but he comes to believe, being one step ahead of Peter, as he is throughout the text. They go off then, and Mary Magdalene is left the tomb. And here we have perhaps one of the most dramatic encounters of Jesus with someone after his resurrection, reported in the New Testament. Mary is there and weeping and sad, and Jesus, apparently the gardener, looking like the gardener with a nice hat or something, calls Mary by name. And when he does so, Mary knows who he is and perhaps who she is. In any case, this calling by name evokes chapter 10 and the story of the shepherd and his sheep. The shepherd knows his sheep and calls them by name, it said. Once again, an important theme about the intimacy of relationship between Jesus and those who follow him, articulated first with the image of the shepherd and the sheep, is brought to bear again here in the relationship between Jesus and Mary. Mary reaches out to touch Jesus, it would appear. Does she actually get to do so? In any case, Jesus says, the Latin translation is usually used for this scene, noli me tangere, don't be touching me. Whether this is preventing her from getting there or whether she's actually got there to do it is a matter that's debated. But in any case, why the prohibition on touching? Is Jesus saying, you're not worthy to touch me, sinner that you are? You're not worthy to touch me because you're a woman? Or you shouldn't be touching me because you have other business to do. Go and tell my disciples that I have risen from the dead. I think it's the latter, as a matter of fact. But we'll look at that in the artistic tradition in a moment, because that's an interesting point. Jesus says he's going to the Father, but will be coming back. And he comes back very shortly, appearing to the disciples in chapter 20, verses 19 through 23. And this scene where there's food on the table evokes the scene in Luke chapter 24, where there's also food on the table. And some of the elements of the scene are taken out and built into the next scene that the evangelist creates, doing the same sort of move that he made in other cases where he's taken apart materials from the tradition and built them into new stories. In any case, Jesus breathes the Spirit onto the disciples and gives them the power to deal with sin, which is what has happened in the outpouring of divine love. This then leads to the final episode of an appearance in this part of the gospel before we get to the epilogue, with doubting Thomas, who wants to, like Mary, touch, and Jesus invites him to touch. Does he do so? Interesting question. He finally, when he sees Jesus and the wounds in his side that Jesus invites him to probe, he confesses Jesus as my Lord and my God, using the two divine names that we have in the Greek form of the Bible and the Septuagint, the Greek being Kyrios and Theos, which are used to translate Yahweh and Elohim, the two divine names in the Hebrew Bible. So Thomas confesses what the gospel has been suggesting all along, that is, that Jesus is one with the Father in some significant way, and he who sees Jesus sees the Father. There may be, as in so many other cases, yet another twist if John is really playing on the conventions about the divine name and knows something like Philo. Remember, we talked about how Philo is someone who is into name theology and worries about the revelation of the divine name, and says the real divine name of God is the one who is. Well, it may be that something similar is going on here, because in Philo, Kurios and Theos, Lord and God, are names of the powers that manifest the presence of God, but not God's self. And so it may be that if John is framing the encounter of Jesus and Thomas within that kind of Philonic framework, Thomas makes it, but maybe not to the highest grade of enlightenment. If he did make it to the highest grade of enlightenment, he would see that Jesus is, in fact, I am, identical with the Father in some significant way. But he gets very close enough for government work. And in doing so, he raises the issue of, is seeing believing? And throughout the gospel, we've seen the play on seeing, and how just seeing the signs isn't enough. You have to see the signs with the proper understanding to understand what their significance is if you're going to really see them. Seeing physically is not enough. When you have the blind man cured from his blindness that he had from the cradle, as contrasted with the blindness that the Pharisees have even now when they see physically. So physical sight is not enough. It's the insight of seeing with the eyes of the mind and with an open heart to see God's presence and God's love poured out. That's what you really have to see. So this last little play on seeing and believing in the interaction between Jesus and Thomas raises that theme again, the theme of how does one see and how can one see better, as one is called upon to do by this gospel. A brief excursus on some of the artistic representations of at least one of these scenes, the Mary Magdalene scene. We could do a similar thing with the Doubting Thomas scene. But it's interesting to think about what Jesus is saying and saying to Mary, don't be touching me. Here we have Fra Angelico in a rather simple way. Jesus is moving fast. Mary is maybe holding him back a little bit, or would be if she touched him. There's nothing very, nothing sexual about this. Some of the others, especially in the Renaissance and beyond, seem to suggest that there's some sort of relationship there that may be involved, and the touching may be, the prohibition on touching is get out of that relationship, get out of that simple infatuation, get to something deeper. Or you could read this painting that way by Bronzino. Or you could see Mary as being a little aggressive and Jesus saying, please don't dare touch me. You don't want to be touching me. You shouldn't be touching me. And this one here by Titian, I think, carries that notion with it. Ooh, you shouldn't be touching me. You're, insulting my purity or something. As opposed to Rubens, where it's almost the case that Jesus is inviting Mary to touch him. to see his flesh and to understand the resurrected flesh and the importance thereof. Which gets a little closer, perhaps, to the way I read this episode as saying to Mary, don't waste your time reaching out to me. What you have is a job to do. Go do it and tell the apostles what they need to know. Another representation of this scene, the Rembrandt painting focuses on the interaction of Jesus and Mary when Jesus calls her by name and she recognizes him. And as the light behind Jesus suggests, light is dawning when she comes to that recognition. Many portraits of these scenes in John pick out one or another reading of the interaction between the characters, which is ambiguous on the surface. And I think you need to probe it a little bit to see what John is trying to get or trying to